This rare and disturbing photo of slavery in 1963, Virginia will shock you. The hidden but nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the basement of the Virginia Historical Society on that humid August morning, and tucked away in a mislabeled box marked Agricultural Equipment 1960, he found a collection of glass plate negatives that would fundamentally challenge everything Americans thought they knew about slavery in the final years before emancipation. The photograph, that would later become known as the Whitmore Plantation image, was unlike anything in the extensive archives of Civil War documentation. While most photographs from the era showed either sanitized plantation scenes or the aftermath of battles, this image captured something far more sinister: the systematic mentality of slavery in its death throes, when desperate plantation owners resorted to increasingly violent methods to maintain control over their human property. The glass plate negative was remarkably well preserved, protected by layers of cloth, and stored in a wooden box that bore the initials TM carved into its lid. When David held the negative up to the light, the image that emerged made his hands tremble. It showed a group of enslaved people in what appeared to be a punishment formation, their bodies bearing visible signs of recent violence, while Confederate soldiers stood guard in the background. What made this photograph particularly shocking was its timing. Taken in 1963, during the height of the Civil War, it documented the brutal reality of slavery, even as the institution was beginning to collapse. This was not the paternalistic system that Confederate apologists would later claim existed, but a regime of terror that had grown more vicious as its end approached. The negative bore a small notation etched into the glass: Whitmore Plantation, Henrico County, Virginia. The handwriting was precise, suggesting someone with education and steady hands, despite what must have been extremely dangerous circumstances for documenting such scene. David's initial research revealed that Whitmore Plantation had been owned by Colonel James Whitmore, a Confederate officer who had left the management of his 400-acre tobacco plantation to his overseer while he served with the Army of Northern Virginia. The plantation was located just outside Richmond, in an area that had become increasingly unstable as Union forces pressed closer to the Confederate capital. Discover the shocking truth about what really happened on Virginia plantations as the Civil War raged. Evidence that has been hidden for 60 years is finally being revealed. As David examined the photograph more closely under magnification, disturbing details emerged that painted a picture of systematic torture designed to prevent enslaved people from escaping to Union lines. The image showed approximately 15 enslaved people, ranging in age from children to elderly adults, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate formation. Their clothing was torn and blood-stained, and several showed signs of recent beating. Most disturbing of all, the photograph captured what appeared to be a public execution in progress. In the center of the image, a young man, probably in his early 20s, was suspended from a makeshift gallows, while the other enslaved people were forced to watch. The Confederate soldiers in the background were not merely observers, they were active participants in what could only be described as a war crime. The discovery of this photograph would lead David down a path of investigation that would reveal not just the story of one plantation's descent into barbarism, but a widespread pattern of atrocities committed by Confederate forces and plantation owners as they desperately tried to maintain the institution of slavery, even as it crumbled around them. But who was TM, and how had they managed to document these horrors without being discovered? The answer to that question would prove to be as shocking as the photograph itself, involving a network of resistance that operated in the very heart of the Confederacy. David's investigation into the mysterious led him through months of archival research, genealogical records, and Civil War military documents. The breakthrough came when he discovered a collection of personal letters in the papers of a Union intelligence officer, letters that revealed the existence of a covert photography operation designed to document Confederate war crimes for potential post-war prosecutions. was Thomas Mitchell, a free black man from Philadelphia who had been trained as a photographer before the war and had volunteered for a dangerous mission behind Confederate lines. Working under the cover of being a traveling tintype photographer serving Confederate soldiers, Mitchell had been secretly documenting the brutal treatment of enslaved people throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. Mitchell's mission was part of a larger Union intelligence operation designed to gather evidence of Confederate atrocities that could be used to justify harsh post-war Reconstruction policies. The operation was so secret that even most Union commanders were unaware of its existence, and Mitchell operated with minimal support, relying on a network of enslaved people and sympathetic whites to move safely through Confederate territory. The letters revealed that Mitchell had been operating in Virginia since early 1962, using his legitimate photography business as cover while secretly documenting the escalating violence on plantations throughout the region. His official photographs showed Confederate soldiers in heroic poses, but his hidden work captured the reality of a slave system that was becoming increasingly desperate and violent as military defeat loomed. Mitchell's correspondence with his Union handlers described the challenges of his mission. He wrote about the constant danger of discovery, the difficulty of obtaining photographic supplies in the war-torn South, and the psychological toll of witnessing and documenting unspeakable cruelty. His letters also revealed his deep commitment to ensuring that the truth about slavery would not be buried with the Confederacy. The Whitmore plantation photograph was taken during one of Mitchell's most dangerous assignments. According to his reports, he had been hired by Colonel Whitmore's wife to photograph Confederate soldiers who were recuperating at the plantation after being wounded in the Battle of Chancellorsville. What he discovered there was a systematic campaign of terror designed to prevent enslaved people from escaping to Union lines. The secret network of photographers and spies who documented Confederate war crimes reveals a hidden chapter of Civil War history that most Americans have never learned about. Mitchell's letters describe the scene at Whitmore Plantation in horrifying detail. The plantation had become a virtual prison camp, where enslaved people were subjected to increasingly brutal punishments for any perceived infractions. The Confederate soldiers stationed there were not just recovering from wounds. They were actively participating in the torture and murder of enslaved people under the guise of maintaining order behind Confederate lines. The photograph captured what Mitchell described as a demonstration execution, the public hanging of a young enslaved man named Joshua, who had been caught attempting to escape to Union lines. The execution was designed to terrorize the remaining enslaved population and discourage further escape attempts. The other enslaved people in the photograph were forced to watch as a warning of what would happen to anyone who tried to seek freedom. Mitchell's documentation revealed that such executions had become common on plantations throughout the region as the war progressed. Plantation owners and Confederate authorities were increasingly desperate to maintain control over their enslaved workforce, especially as news of the Emancipation Proclamation spread and Union armies advanced deeper into Confederate territory. The photographer's letters also described the psychological state of the enslaved people. In counter, many spoke of their determination to reach Union lines despite the risks, while others had been so traumatized by the violence they had witnessed that they were afraid to attempt escape. The photograph captured this complex emotional reality, the mixture of terror, defiance, and desperate hope that characterized the enslaved experience in the final years of the Civil War. Mitchell's mission came to an abrupt end in late 1963, when his true identity was discovered by Confederate authorities. His final letter, smuggled out through the underground network, described his capture and the destruction of much of his photographic equipment. He was executed as a spy in December 1963, but not before he had managed to hide his most important photographs, including the Whitmore plantation image, in locations where they would eventually be discovered by Union forces. As David delved deeper into the history of Whitmore plantation, it uncovered a story that illustrated the broader collapse of the Confederate slave system in the final years of the Civil War. The plantation, which had once been a model of efficiency and profitability, had developed into a site of desperate violence as the institution of slavery entered its death throes. Colonel James Whitmore had inherited the plantation from his father in Itiotamanfinco, along a went to Asiento enslaved the people and a thriving tobacco operation that generated substantial profits. When the war began, Whitmore had enthusiastically joined the Confederate cause, believing that military victory would secure the future of slavery and the Southern way of life. He left the plantation under the management of his wife, Margaret, and his overseer, a brutal man named Silas Crawford. By 1863, the situation at Whitmore Plantation had deteriorated dramatically. The Union naval blockade had made it difficult to ship tobacco to market, while the Confederate government's impressment policies had requisitioned much of the plantation's livestock and equipment for military use. More critically, the enslaved population had become increasingly restless as news of Union victories and the Emancipation Proclamation spread throughout the region. Thomas Mitchell's photographs and written reports documented the plantation's transformation from agricultural enterprise to prison camp. Crawford, with the support of Margaret Whitmore and the Confederate soldiers stationed there, had implemented a regime of terror designed to prevent escapes and maintain productivity despite the deteriorating conditions. The plantation's enslaved population had dropped from 127 to 89, between 1961 and 1963, with most of the missing people having escaped to Union lines or died from violence, disease, or malnutrition. Those who remained had faced increasingly harsh conditions as the plantation's resources dwindled and its managers became more desperate to maintain control. Mitchell's documentation revealed that Whitmore Plantation had become part of a network of Confederate installations designed to prevent enslaved people from reaching Union forces. The plantation served as both a detention center for recaptured escapees and a staging area for Confederate raids against nearby Union positions. The soldiers stationed there were not just recovering from wounds, they were actively engaged in what amounted to a guerrilla war against both Union forces and the enslaved population. The systematic campaign of terror implemented on Confederate plantations as the Civil War progressed reveals the true nature of slavery in its final, most desperate phase. The photograph captured the aftermath of one of the plantation's most brutal episodes. According to Mitchell's reports, Joshua, the young man being executed in the image, had been part of a group of 7 enslaved people who had attempted to escape to Union lines in early 6 of the 7 had been recaptured, and their public execution was designed to send a message to the remaining enslaved population. The execution was carried out with deliberate cruelty. The condemned were not simply hanged, they were tortured beforehand and forced to watch as their companions died. The surviving enslaved people were required to witness the executions and then to dispose of the bodies, creating a psychological trauma that was intended to destroy any thoughts of resistance or escape. Mitchell's letters describe the state of the enslaved people he encountered at Whitmore Plantation. Many showed signs of severe malnutrition, as food supplies had been diverted to support Confederate military operations. Others bore the marks of recent beatings, brandings, and other forms of physical abuse. Children as young as 10 were forced to work in the tobacco fields under conditions that would have been considered harsh even by antebellum standards. The plantation's infrastructure had also deteriorated significantly. The slave quarters, which had never been comfortable, had become overcrowded and unsanitary as the population was consolidated. To make surveillance easier, medical care was virtually non-existent, and diseases spread rapidly through the confined population. Mitchell documented several cases of enslaved people dying from treatable conditions because medical attention was denied as punishment for perceived infractions. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Mitchell's reports revealed that the violence at Whitmore Plantation was not the result of individual cruelty, but part of a systematic policy implemented throughout the Confederate-controlled areas of Virginia. Plantation owners, Confederate military commanders, and local authorities had coordinated their efforts to create a reign of terror designed to prevent enslaved people from escaping and to maintain the institution of slavery even as military defeat became increasingly likely. The photograph that Mitchell captured was not just a guillotine of isolated brutality, but evidence of war crimes committed by Confederate forces against civilian populations. The systematic torture and murder of enslaved people violated even the limited protections that international law provided to civilian populations during wartime. Yet these crimes were committed with the full knowledge and approval of Confederate authorities. Davies' research revealed that Thomas Mitchell's photography mission was supported by an extensive underground network that included enslaved people, free blacks, white abolitionists, and even some Confederate deserters who had become disillusioned with the cause they had once supported. This network operated throughout the Confederate States, gathering intelligence, helping enslaved people escape, and documenting atrocities for potential post-war prosecutions. The network's existence had been one of the best-kept secrets of the Civil War, known only to a handful of Union intelligence officers and the brave individuals who risked their lives to participate in its operations. The discovery of Mitchell's photographs provided the first concrete evidence of this network's activities and revealed the extent to which resistance to slavery had penetrated even the heart of the Confederacy. At Whitmore Plantation, the network was led by an enslaved woman named Sarah, who worked as a house servant and had access to information about Confederate military movements and plantation security. Sarah had been secretly literate since childhood, having been taught to read by the plantation owner's daughter before the war, and she used her position to gather intelligence that was passed along to Union forces through a chain of contacts that extended all the way to Washington. Mitchell's letters describe Sarah as a woman of extraordinary courage and intelligence who had organized a sophisticated information-gathering operation among the enslaved population. She had established communication networks that allowed enslaved people on different plantations to share information about escape routes, Confederate troop movements, and planned punishments or executions. The network also included several white participants who had become horrified by the escalating violence they witnessed. Among them was Dr. William Hayes, a Confederate Army surgeon who had been stationed at Whitmore Plantation to treat wounded soldiers. Hayes had become increasingly disturbed by the brutality he witnessed and had begun secretly treating injured enslaved people and passing information to the underground network. Hayes's medical journal, discovered among his papers after the war, provided corroborating evidence for many of Mitchell's reports. The doctor documented numerous cases of enslaved people who had been severely injured during punishments, describing wounds that were clearly the result of systematic torture rather than routine plantation discipline. His journal also revealed that he had secretly photographed some of the injuries he treated, creating additional evidence of the atrocities being committed. The secret network of resistance that operated in the heart of the Confederacy included some of the most unlikely allies, revealing that opposition to slavery existed even among those who were supposed to support it. The network's most dangerous mission was helping enslaved people escape to Union lines. This required detailed knowledge of Confederate troop positions, patrol schedules, and safe routes through the Virginia countryside. The network had established a series of safe houses and hiding places that allowed escapees to move gradually toward Union territory, often taking weeks or months to complete the journey. Mitchell's photographs documented not just the brutality that escapees faced if they were recaptured, but also the sophisticated methods that the network used to help people reach freedom. Hidden in his collection were images of secret signals, coded messages, and concealed supply caches that revealed the extent of the resistance operation. The network also served as an early warning system for planned executions and punishments. When Confederate authorities decided to make examples of particular enslaved peoples, word would spread quickly through the network, allowing others to prepare for the psychological trauma of witnessing such events, or in some cases to attempt interventions that might save lives. Sarah's role in the network extended beyond intelligence gathering to active resistance, Mitchell's letters described how she had organized work, slowdowns, sabotage equipment, and even helped some enslaved people fake illnesses to avoid punishment. Her activities were incredibly dangerous, as discovery would have meant certain death, but she continued her resistance work throughout the war. The network's documentation efforts were not limited to photography. Participants kept detailed written records of atrocities, maintained lists of victims and perpetrators, and preserved testimony from witnesses. This documentation was intended to support post-war prosecutions of Confederate war criminals, though most of these prosecutions never materialized due to the political compromises of Reconstruction. Mitchell's mission was part of a larger effort to ensure that the truth about Confederate atrocities would not be buried with the war's end. The network understood that Confederate sympathizers would attempt to rewrite history, portraying slavery as a benevolent institution and the Confederacy as a noble cause. The photographs and documents they preserved were intended to serve as irrefutable evidence of the reality of slavery and the crimes committed in its defense. The network's activities continued even after Mitchell's capture and execution. Other photographers and documentarians took up his work, and the flow of intelligence and escaped enslaved people continued until the war's end. The network's success in preserving evidence of Confederate atrocities would prove crucial in the immediate post-war period, even though much of this evidence was later suppressed during the era of reconciliation that followed Reconstruction. As the Civil War entered its final phase in 1864 and 1865, the situation at Whitmore Plantation and similar installations throughout the Confederacy became increasingly desperate. Davies' research revealed that the violence documented in Mitchell's photographs was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign of terror that intensified as Confederate defeat became inevitable. Colonel Whitmore had been killed at the Battle of Cold Harbor in June 1864, leaving his wife Margaret in complete control of the plantation. Rather than moderating the brutal policies that had characterized the plantation's operations, she escalated them, apparently believing that extreme violence was the only way to maintain control as the Confederate cause collapsed around her. The plantation's enslaved population had continued to decline, dropping to fewer than 60 people by early 1880. Many had escaped to Union lines, while others had died from violence, disease, or malnutrition. Those who remained faced conditions that had deteriorated beyond anything previously documented, even by the brutal standards of Confederate slavery. Union intelligence reports from this period, discovered among the papers of General Benjamin Butler, described Whitmore Plantation as a scene of horrors that defies description. Union scouts who had infiltrated the area reported systematic torture, mass executions, and conditions that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The plantation had essentially become a concentration camp, where enslaved people were worked to death or killed outright. Margaret Whitmore's correspondence with other plantation owners, preserved in family papers, revealed the mindset that drove this escalating violence. She wrote about her determination to make them pay for their disloyalty and her belief that extreme punishment was necessary to prevent a general uprising that might threaten white civilians throughout the region. The letters also revealed that the violence at Whitmore Plantation was coordinated with similar operations throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. Plantation owners had formed informal networks to share information about effective disciplinary techniques and to coordinate their responses to escape attempts and other forms of resistance. The final phase of slavery revealed the true nature of the institution when its supporters became desperate, implementing policies that amounted to genocide against the enslaved population. Dr. Hayes's medical journal from this period documented the systematic nature of the violence. It described it being forced to treat injuries that were clearly the result of torture, including burns, broken bones, and wounds from whippings that had been deliberately infected to cause maximum suffering. His journal also revealed that he had been ordered to perform medical experiments on enslaved people, procedures that had no therapeutic purpose and were designed solely to cause pain and terror. The doctor's journal entries from early 1865 showed his growing horror at what he was witnessing. He wrote about enslaved people who had been deliberately starved, children who had been separated from their parents as punishment, and elderly people who had been worked to death despite their obvious inability to perform heavy labor. His final entries described his decision to desert from the Confederate Army rather than continue participating in what he called crimes against humanity. The underground network that had supported Mitchell's mission continued to operate during this period, though with increasing difficulty as Confederate security measures intensified. Sarah, the enslaved woman who had led the resistance at Whitmore Plantation, was eventually discovered and executed in February 1865, just months before the war's end. Her death was particularly brutal, designed to terrorize the remaining enslaved population into absolute submission. The network's final reports described conditions at Whitmore Plantation that bordered on extermination. Enslaved people were being killed for increasingly minor infractions, and the plantation's managers seemed determined to eliminate the entire enslaved population rather than allow them to experience freedom. The reports suggested that similar policies were being implemented at plantations throughout the region, representing a final, desperate attempt to destroy the evidence of slavery's brutality. Union forces finally reached Whitmore Plantation in April 1865, just days before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. What they found there shocked even hardened veterans who had witnessed the carnage of 4 years of warfare. The plantation had been largely destroyed, its buildings burned, and its fields abandoned. Of the 22,000 enslaved people who had lived there at the war's beginning, fewer than 30 survived to see liberation. The survivors' testimony, recorded by Union officers, corroborated the evidence that Mitchell and the underground network had gathered. They described the years of escalating violence, systematic torture, and mass executions that had been designed to terrorize them into submission. Their accounts provided crucial evidence for the war crimes prosecutions that many Union officials hoped to pursue against Confederate leaders and plantation owners. Margaret Whitmore was arrested by Union forces and charged with war crimes, but she was released during the general amnesty that followed Lincoln's assassination. She died in 1867, never having faced justice for the hundreds of people who had died under her authority. El caso exemplified the failure of Reconstruction era justice to hold Confederate war criminals accountable for their actions. The end of the Civil War marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to suppress evidence of Confederate atrocities and rewrite the history of slavery in America. David research revealed that the photographs and documentation gathered by Thomas Mitchell and the Underground Network became targets of a deliberate cover-up that involved former Confederate leaders, Northern politicians seeking reconciliation, and even some Union officer who believed that revealing the full truth about slavery would be counterproductive to national healing. The cover-up began almost immediately after the war's end. Many of the Union intelligence files that contained evidence of Confederate war crimes were classified and hidden away in government archives, where they remained largely inaccessible to historians for more than a century. The official justification was that revealing such evidence would inflame sectional tensions and make reconciliation more difficult, but the real motivation was often political expediency. Former Confederate leaders understood that their post-war rehabilitation depended on controlling the narrative about slavery and the war. They organized systematic campaigns to destroy evidence of atrocities, intimidate witnesses, and promote alternative versions of history that portrayed slavery as a benevolent institution and the Confederacy as a noble cause. These efforts were remarkably successful, shaping American understanding of slavery for generations. The photographs that Mitchell had hidden were discovered by Union forces in 1865, but most were quickly classified and removed from public view. Only a few images were ever used in war crimes prosecutions, and even those were often suppressed when the prosecutions were abandoned in favor of reconciliation policies. The Whitmore plantation photograph was among those that disappeared into government archives, where it remained hidden for more than 150 years. Northern politicians played a crucial role in the cover-up, often for reasons that had little to do with Southern sensitivities. Many Republicans believed that focusing on Confederate atrocities would distract from their efforts to promote economic development and westward expansion. They worried that dwelling on the horrors of slavery would make it more difficult to attract Southern investment and political cooperation. The cover-up also involved the systematic destruction of evidence by former plantation owners and Confederate officials. Margaret Whitmore's papers, for example, were largely destroyed by her family after her death, eliminating crucial documentation of the atrocities committed at the plantation. Similar destruction occurred throughout the former Confederacy, as families and institutions worked to eliminate evidence that might implicate their ancestors in war crimes. The systematic suppression of evidence about Confederate war crimes reveals how historical narratives are shaped by political power rather than factual accuracy. Even some abolitionists and Union veterans participated in the cover-up, believing that revealing the full extent of slavery's brutality would be counterproductive to their goals. They worried that Northern audiences would be so horrified by the evidence that they would dismiss it as exaggerated propaganda, undermining efforts to secure civil rights for freed slaves. This well-intentioned but misguided approach contributed to the sanitization of slavery's history. The cover-up extended to academic institutions and historical societies, which often refused to preserve or display evidence of slavery's brutality. The Virginia Historical Society, where David eventually discovered Mitchell's photograph, had actually received several collections of Civil War photographs over the years, but had systematically mislabeled or hidden those that showed evidence of Confederate atrocities. The success of the cover-up can be measured by its lasting impact on American historical consciousness. For more than a century after the Civil War, most Americans learned a sanitized version of slavery that minimized its brutality and emphasized supposed benefits to enslaved people. This false narrative made it easier for subsequent generations to ignore the ongoing effects of slavery and resist efforts to address racial inequality. The cover-up also involved the systematic exclusion of African American voices from historical narratives. The testimony of enslaved people who had witnessed and survived atrocities like those at Whitmore Plantation was dismissed as unreliable or biased, while the accounts of former Confederate leaders were accepted as authoritative. This racial bias in historical methodology ensured that the truth about slavery remained hidden even when evidence was available. Dr. Hayes's medical journal, which provided crucial corroborating evidence for Mitchell's photographs, was among the documents that were suppressed during this period. The journal was donated to a medical college in Richmond after Hayes's death, but it was quickly removed from public access when its contents became known. It remained hidden in the college's archives until David's research brought it to light. The underground network that had supported Mitchell's mission was also targeted for suppression. Many of its participants were intimidated into silence, while others were discredited or marginalized. Sarah's role in the resistance at Whitmore Plantation, for example, was completely erased from historical records, and her very existence was denied by plantation apologists, who claimed that enslaved people had been content with their condition. The cover-up was so successful that even many professional historians remained unaware of the extent of Confederate atrocities. The evidence that Mitchell and others had risked their lives to preserve was effectively buried, allowing myths about the lost cause and the supposed benevolence of slavery to flourish in American popular culture. David Harrison's discovery of the Whitmore Plantation photograph in 2023 marked the beginning of a long overdue reckoning with the suppressed history of Confederate war crimes and the true nature of slavery in its final, most desperate phase. The image that had been hidden for century years finally emerged at a time when America was grappling with its racial past and the ongoing legacy of slavery. The photograph's revelation generated immediate controversy and intense public interest. When David first presented his findings at a conference of Civil War historians, the response was explosive. Some historians hailed the discovery as a breakthrough that would fundamentally change understanding of the war's final phase, while others questioned the photograph's authenticity or argued that it represented an isolated incident rather than systematic policy. The debate intensified when David published his research Darwin, a major historical article, accompanied by high-resolution images of Mitchell's photograph and supporting documentation. The article generated national media attention, with major newspapers and television networks covering the story and sparking a broader conversation about how Americans remember their past. Descendants of enslaved people responded to the photograph's revelation with a mixture of vindication and grief. Many spoke about how the image validated family stories that had been dismissed as exaggerated or impossible by previous generations of historians. The photograph provided visual proof of the horrors that their ancestors had endured and survived, giving weight to oral traditions that had been marginalized by official historical narratives. The response from descendants of Confederate families was more complex. Some expressed shock and horror at the evidence of atrocities committed by their ancestors, while others questioned the photograph's authenticity or context. A few families came forward with additional documentation that corroborated David's findings, including letters and diaries that had been hidden in family archives for generations. The photograph also sparked renewed interest in the broader question of Confederate war crimes and the failure of post-war justice. Legal scholars began examining whether some of the atrocities documented by Mitchell and others might still be prosecutable under international law, while historians called for a comprehensive review of suppressed evidence from the Civil War era. The complete archive of suppressed Civil War photographs reveals evidence that will force Americans to confront the true history of slavery and its violent end. David's research team, working with advanced digital imaging technology, was able to enhance Mitchell's photograph and reveal details that had been invisible to previous generations. The enhanced image showed additional evidence of systematic torture, including branding marks on several of the enslaved people and what appeared to be deliberate mutilation designed to prevent escape attempts. The team also used genealogical research and DNA analysis to identify some of the people in the photograph. Working with descending communities, they were able to restore names and stories to individuals who had been anonymous victims for more than a century. These identifications transformed the photograph from a general documentation of atrocity into a specific memorial to particular people whose lives and suffering mattered. The discovery led to a broader investigation of suppressed Civil War documentation. David's team located additional photographs and documents that had been hidden in archives throughout the country, revealing evidence of systematic atrocities that extended far beyond Whitmore Plantation. The evidence suggested that the violence, documented by Mitchell, was part of a coordinated campaign of terror that affected thousands of enslaved people throughout the Confederacy. Museums and educational institutions began incorporating the new evidence into their exhibitions and curricula, finally presenting visitors with the complete truth about slavery's brutality. The National Museum of African American History and Culture created a special exhibition featuring Mitchell's photographs and the stories of the people they depicted, drawing record crowds and generating intense emotional responses from visitors. The photograph's revelation also sparked a renewed debate about Confederate monuments and memorials. Critics argued that the evidence of systematic atrocities made it impossible to continue honoring Confederate leaders and soldiers, while defenders claimed that the monuments represented heritage rather than hatred. The debate reflected broader tensions about how America should remember its past and confront its ongoing legacy of racial inequality. Perhaps most importantly, the photograph served as a catalyst for broader conversations about truth, reconciliation, and justice. Community organizations used the image and its story to support reparations initiatives, arguing that the evidence of systematic violence demonstrated the need for meaningful redress for historical injustices. The photograph became a powerful symbol of both the horrors of slavery and the importance of preserving historical truth. David's work also revealed the extent to which historical narratives had been shaped by political power rather than factual accuracy. The systematic suppression of evidence about considered atrocities demonstrated how those in power could control collective memory, shaping public understanding of the past to serve their contemporary interests. The discovery of Mitchell's photograph ultimately served as a reminder that the truth as a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to suppress it. The image that Confederate sympathizers had tried to bury for hundreds of years finally emerged to bear witness to crimes that had never been properly acknowledged or prosecuted. In preserving this evidence, Thomas Mitchell and the Underground Network had ensured that the voices of the enslaved would eventually be heard, even if justice had been delayed for more than a century. As David concluded his presentation of the findings, he reflected on the power of a single photograph to change history. The Whitmore plantation image had not only revealed the truth about Confederate atrocities, but had also exposed the systematic efforts to suppress that truth. In doing so, it had forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about their past and their ongoing responsibility to ensure that such horrors never happen again. The rare and disturbing photograph of slavery in 1863, Virginia had finally shocked the world, just as Thomas Mitchell had hoped it would when he risked his life to capture it. In preserving this image, he had preserved not just evidence of historical atrocity, but a testament to the courage of those who resist injustice and the ultimate power of truth to survive even the most determined efforts to destroy it. This story, while fictional, is based on extensive historical research about the conditions of slavery during the Civil War and the systematic efforts to suppress evidence of Confederate atrocities. The characters and specific events are imagined, but they reflect the cumulative historical realities about the escalating violence that characterized slavery's final phase and the post-war campaign to sanitize its history.